The neon lights of downtown Chicago reflected off the rain-soaked pavement as Claire Bennett rushed from the train station to her office building. She clutched her laptop bag tightly, the strap digging into her shoulder. It was 6:45 a.m., earlier than most people would arrive, but Claire wasn't like most people. The quiet hum of the empty office was the only environment where she felt even remotely productive. The distractions of a bustling workplace, small talk, phones ringing, laughter from the break room, only added to the pressure that had become her constant companion. Claire had always prided herself on being the hardest worker in the room. She was the go-to person for tight deadlines, the employee who stayed late to fix last-minute errors. But lately, the cracks were starting to show. Her to-do lists never seemed to shrink, her focus slipped constantly, and no matter how many hours she put in, the work never felt done. Her manager, Vanessa, had started noticing too. "Claire, can we talk?" Vanessa had said a week ago, closing the door to her office. Claire's stomach twisted at the memory. "I'm worried about you," Vanessa had continued. "You're working harder than ever, but something feels off. You're missing deadlines, forgetting things. Are you okay?" Claire had nodded quickly, offering a tight smile. "Just a lot on my plate," she'd said, deflecting the concern. Vanessa didn't press further, but the conversation left Claire rattled. As she settled into her desk that morning, Claire stared at the open spreadsheet on her screen. The numbers blurred together, refusing to make sense. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of her desk. Her heart raced, a familiar wave of panic rising in her chest. It was the same feeling that had haunted her for years, though she never spoke about it. The truth was, Claire's struggle with productivity wasn't about the workload or her job. It was about the weight of something she couldn't name, something she had buried so deeply that she had convinced herself it didn't exist. But it did exist. 3 years earlier, Claire had survived a car accident that left her with a permanent scar on her left shoulder. Physically, she had recovered quickly, but the aftermath lingered in ways she hadn't anticipated. The accident had happened on a rainy night, not unlike this one. Claire had been driving home after a long day at work when a truck ran a red light, slamming into her car. The impact flipped her vehicle, and she woke up in the hospital hours later, disoriented and terrified. For months, she had nightmares about the crash. Every honking horn or sudden noise sent her heart racing. But life didn't stop, so she pushed forward, pretending everything was fine. She went back to work, buried herself in projects, and refused to dwell on what had happened. Her friends praised her resilience, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the sleepless nights, the constant tension in her body, or the way she avoided driving altogether. Claire had convinced herself she had moved on, but the trauma had followed her, shaping her in ways she didn't understand. Now, as she sat in her office, the weight of that silent burden pressed down harder than ever. The more she tried to ignore it, the heavier it became. Claire rubbed her temples, her mind foggy. She couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. She opened her email inbox, scanning the flood of unread messages, and felt a familiar pang of inadequacy. "Why can't I just get it together?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She had always prided herself on being the kind of person who thrived under pressure. But now, even the simplest tasks felt impossible. She thought of Vanessa's words from last week. "Are you okay?" For the first time, Claire allowed herself to admit the truth. She wasn't. That evening, as she rode the train home, Claire scrolled aimlessly through her phone, her reflection in the window staring back at her. She came across a social media post from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The caption read, "Trauma doesn't go away just because you ignore it. Healing starts when you face it." The words hit her like a jolt. Claire saved the post, reading it over and over. The idea of facing her trauma felt terrifying, but ignoring it wasn't working either. She thought about the accident, the way it had changed her, and the way she had refused to confront it. As the train pulled into her stop, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would try. The next morning, Claire woke up with a sense of unease. The thought of facing her trauma lingered like a distant storm cloud. She wasn't even sure where to begin. Therapy, journaling, talking to someone she trusted, all the options felt overwhelming. But the alternative, continuing to spiral under the weight of it, was no longer acceptable. At work, Claire's productivity was worse than ever. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind wandered. Every email she opened felt like a mountain to climb, and even small assignments seemed insurmountable. By mid-afternoon, she had barely accomplished anything. During her lunch break, she sat at her desk, staring at her phone. She remembered the social media post she had saved the night before. Healing starts when you face it. Her thumb hovered over the search bar, and before she could overthink it, she typed, "How to start dealing with trauma." The results were endless. Articles, videos, self-help books, forums. One article caught her eye. "Signs your trauma is affecting your productivity." As Claire read, her chest tightened. The list of signs felt like a checklist of her own struggles. Difficulty concentrating, overworking to avoid feelings, constant self-doubt, avoidance of certain tasks or situations. The article suggested that unresolved trauma could manifest in subtle but insidious ways, often disguising itself as stress or burnout. It also emphasized the importance of seeking professional help. Claire hesitated. Therapy had always seemed like something other people needed, not her, but hadn't she reached her breaking point? That evening she found herself Googling local therapists. She scrolled through profiles, feeling a strange mix of hope and fear. One name stood out: Dr. Rachel Carter. Her bio mentioned experience with trauma recovery and workplace stress. Claire stared at the book appointment button for a long time before clicking it. The following week, Claire walked into Dr. Carter's office, her palms sweating. The waiting room was quiet, the walls painted a soothing shade of blue. She sat on the edge of her chair, clutching her bag like a lifeline. When her name was called, Claire followed Dr. Carter into a cozy office filled with books and a small potted plant on the windowsill. "So, what brings you here today?" Dr. Carter asked, her tone gentle. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I've been struggling at work," she began. "I can't focus and I feel stuck, like I'm failing all the time." Dr. Carter nodded. "That's a good place to start. Can you tell me more about what's been going on?" As Claire spoke, the words spilled out faster than she expected. She told Dr. Carter about the accident, the nightmares, the avoidance, and the constant pressure she felt to prove herself. "It's like I've been carrying this weight for years," Claire said, her voice breaking. "But I don't know how to put it down." Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly. "Trauma has a way of embedding itself into our daily lives, often in ways we don't recognize. It sounds like your accident left more than physical scars. It's been affecting your emotions, your thoughts, even your sense of self-worth." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "I've always thought I just needed to work harder, to push through it." "That's a common response," Dr. Carter said, "but healing doesn't come from ignoring the pain. It comes from acknowledging it and learning how to process it." Over the next few sessions, Claire began to unpack the layers of her trauma. Dr. Carter helped her identify the ways it had infiltrated her life, her perfectionism, her tendency to overwork, and her avoidance of situations that reminded her of the accident. One breakthrough came when they discussed her relationship with productivity. "Why do you feel like you have to work so hard?" Dr. Carter asked during one session. Claire hesitated. "Because if I don't, I'll fall behind. I'll fail." Dr. Carter nodded. "And what would failure mean to you?" Claire blinked, the question catching her off guard. She had never thought about it that way before. "It would mean I'm not good enough," she admitted. "And where do you think that belief comes from?" Dr. Carter pressed gently. Claire's mind drifted to her childhood. Her father had always emphasized achievement, praising her only when she brought home perfect grades or won awards. She realized that she had internalized the idea that her worth was tied to her success. The realization was both painful and liberating. Outside of therapy, Claire began to make small but meaningful changes. She started journaling in the evenings, a practice Dr. Carter recommended for processing emotions. At first, the blank pages intimidated her, but soon she found comfort in pouring her thoughts onto paper. She also began setting boundaries at work, something she had never done before. When Vanessa assigned her a new project with an unreasonable deadline, Claire hesitated before speaking up. "I'll need an extra week to do this properly," she said, her heart pounding. To her surprise, Vanessa nodded. "That's fine. Thanks for letting me know." The interaction left Claire feeling empowered. She realized that much of the pressure she felt was self-imposed, rooted in her own fear of failure. As Claire continued her journey, she began to notice subtle shifts in her productivity. Tasks that once felt overwhelming became more manageable. She allowed herself to take breaks without guilt and celebrated small victories instead of fixating on perceived shortcomings. For the first time in years, Claire felt like she was moving forward, not just at work, but in life. Claire sat in her car outside the office on a crisp Friday morning, gripping the steering wheel. She had arrived 15 minutes early, but instead of heading straight inside as she usually did, she found herself staring at the dashboard. Her heart raced, and her palms were clammy. Today was different. It was Vanessa, her manager, had called for an all-staff meeting to discuss a new initiative that required volunteers to lead task forces. Claire knew her name would be mentioned as a strong candidate for one of the leadership roles. Her past self would have immediately jumped at the opportunity, eager to prove her worth. But now, sitting in her car, Claire wasn't so sure. Her therapy sessions with Dr. Carter had forced her to confront the perfectionism and fear of failure that had driven her for so long. She had learned to recognize how these patterns, born from her trauma, influenced her decisions. Yet knowing wasn't the same as changing. As she sat there, Claire replayed a conversation from her last session. "What does leadership mean to you?" Dr. Carter had asked after Claire mentioned the upcoming meeting. Claire had shrugged. "Responsibility, pressure, a chance to show I'm capable." Dr. Carter had tilted her head slightly. "And what would happen if you chose not to take on that responsibility?" The question had unsettled Claire. "I guess people might think I'm not ambitious or not good enough." Dr. Carter leaned forward. "Or maybe they'd see someone who knows her limits and values her well-being." Claire, leadership doesn't have to be about proving yourself to others. It can be about making choices that align with your values. Now, in the silence of her car, Claire tried to absorb those words. What were her values? She had spent so long chasing external validation that she wasn't sure anymore. But one thing was clear. The relentless pace she had maintained for years wasn't sustainable. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and headed inside. The meeting began with the usual formalities, updates, deadlines, and announcements. Claire tried to focus, but her mind buzzed with anticipation. Finally, Vanessa stood at the front of the room, holding a stack of papers. "As many of you know, we're launching a new initiative next month, and we'll need team leaders to guide the process. I've already identified a few of you who would be great fits for these roles." Claire's chest tightened as Vanessa's eyes met hers. "Claire, your ability to juggle multiple projects and deliver results under pressure makes you an ideal candidate for one of these teams," Vanessa said with a smile. The room filled with a polite murmur of agreement, and Claire felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice steady. "But I'd like to take some time to consider before committing." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but nodded. "Of course. Let me know by Monday." After the meeting, Claire retreated to her desk, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't deny the sense of pride she felt at being recognized, but there was something else, a quiet voice urging her to step back, to prioritize herself for once. That evening, she wrote about it in her journal. "I've spent years saying yes to everything because I was afraid of being seen as weak. But what if saying no isn't weakness? What if it's strength? On Monday morning, Claire walked into Vanessa's office, her decision made. "Vanessa, I appreciate the opportunity, but I've decided not to take on the leadership role this time," Claire said, her voice firm but calm. Vanessa's expression shifted from surprise to understanding. "May I ask why?" "I need to focus on my current responsibilities and my own growth right now," Claire replied. "I want to make sure I'm fully present for the work I'm already doing." Vanessa nodded. "That's a mature decision, Claire. I respect it." As Claire left the office, she felt an unfamiliar but liberating sense of control. For the first time, she had made a choice based on what she needed, not what she thought others expected of her. The turning point wasn't just about saying no to a role, it was about redefining what success meant to her. Claire began to apply this mindset in other areas of her life. She no longer worked late hours out of guilt or fear. She learned to delegate tasks, trusting her colleagues instead of micromanaging. At home, she started setting boundaries with friends and family. When Emma, her sister, asked her to help plan a last-minute party, Claire politely declined, explaining that she needed a quiet weekend to recharge. Emma was surprised but supportive. "I'm proud of you for taking care of yourself," she said. One evening, as Claire walked through her neighborhood park, she noticed how much lighter she felt. The tension in her chest, once a constant companion, had eased. She still had moments of doubt and anxiety, but they no longer controlled her. The biggest shift, Claire realized, was in how she spoke to herself. The harsh, critical voice that had driven her for years was quieter now, replaced by one that was gentler, more forgiving. As she sat on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire pulled out her journal. She wrote, "I thought healing was about fixing what was broken, but maybe it's about accepting who I am and choosing to move forward anyway." Claire's decision to step back from the leadership role had been a turning point, but the real test of her transformation came weeks later when an unexpected crisis struck. It was mid-December, and the office was bustling with end-of-year deadlines. Claire was wrapping up a quarterly report when Vanessa walked in, her usual calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "Claire, we've got a problem," Vanessa said, handing her a folder. "The client for the Barton project just requested major revisions, and they want it by tomorrow." Claire opened the folder, scanning the notes. The Barton project was one of the company's largest accounts, and losing it could mean significant losses. Her stomach tightened as she realized the scope of the changes. "This isn't doable in one day," Claire said, her voice steady but firm. "I know," Vanessa replied, "but we don't have a choice. I need you to take the lead on this." Claire felt the weight of the ask, but instead of letting panic take over, she took a deep breath. "I'll need a team," she said. "I can't do this alone." Vanessa nodded. "Pull whoever you need." For most of the day, Claire worked alongside her colleagues, delegating tasks and keeping the team focused. It wasn't easy. Tensions ran high as the clock ticked closer to the deadline. At one point, Carla, a junior employee, broke down in frustration. "I can't figure this part out," Carla said, tears welling in her eyes. In the past, Claire might have taken over the task herself, believing it was quicker to fix it than to teach someone else. But this time, she sat beside Carla and walked her through the process step by step. "You've got this," Claire said, her voice calm. "Take it one piece at a time." By midnight, the revisions were complete, and the team submitted the project with minutes to spare. As they celebrated quietly in the office kitchen, Vanessa approached Claire. "You did an incredible job today," she said. "Not just with the work, but with the team. They trust you because you trust them." Claire felt a wave of pride. For years, she had equated leadership with carrying the burden alone. Now she realized it was about collaboration and support. The next morning, as Claire walked into her apartment, the exhaustion hit her. She collapsed onto the couch, her mind replaying the events of the day. She had handled the pressure differently this time, not by pushing herself to the brink, but by leaning on others and setting boundaries where she could. As she rested, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Carla. Thanks for your help yesterday. I was so stressed, but you made me feel capable. I really appreciate you." Claire smiled, the message reinforcing what she had started to believe, that her worth wasn't tied to being perfect or doing everything herself. The climax of Claire's journey wasn't just about the Barton Project, it was about the realization that her trauma no longer controlled her. That weekend, she visited her parents for dinner. The relationship with her father, once a source of anxiety, had softened since she started therapy. She had shared pieces of her journey with him, and while he wasn't always vocal about his feelings, his efforts to connect had grown. As they sat around the table, her father said, "I heard about the Barton Project. Sounds like you handled it well." Claire looked up surprised. "How did you know about that?" "Your mom mentioned it," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." The words hit Claire harder than she expected. For years, she had chased her father's approval, believing it could only be earned through flawless success. But now, hearing it without having to prove herself, she realized how far she had come. One evening, Claire met Max for coffee. He listened as she recounted the story of the Barton Project and the text from Carla. "You're a completely different person than the one I met a year ago," Max said, smiling. Claire shook her head. "Not different, just finally myself." Max raised his cup in a mock toast. To Claire, the leader who learned to lead herself. They both laughed, but the truth in his words stayed with her. The final test of her growth came when Claire revisited the site of her car accident for the first time. It wasn't planned. She had been driving home from a friend's house when she realized she was near the intersection. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she approached the spot. The memories flooded back, the screech of tires, the impact, the upside-down car. Her heart raced, but she didn't turn away. Claire pulled over to the side of the road and sat there for a long time. She took deep breaths, grounding herself in the present. This wasn't the same moment. It wasn't the same Claire. In that quiet moment, she whispered to herself, "I'm safe now." For the first time, she felt the weight of the trauma lift, replaced by a sense of peace. That night, Claire wrote in her journal, "Trauma tried to define me, but I've rewritten the story. I'm not a victim of what happened. I'm the author of what comes next." The weeks following the Barton Project marked a shift in Claire's life. Her decision to handle the crisis with teamwork and clarity rather than succumbing to panic had earned her respect from her colleagues and renewed confidence in herself. But the real consequences of her transformation went beyond the workplace. At work, the atmosphere had subtly changed. Carla, who had struggled under the weight of her tasks during the Barton crisis, had started approaching Claire more often, not just for guidance, but for mentorship. "I've been thinking about taking on a bigger project," Carla said one afternoon. "But I'm worried I'll mess it up." Claire smiled knowingly. "You're more capable than you think. Start small, break it into steps, and remember that it's okay to ask for help." Hearing her own advice, Claire realized how far she had come. For years, she had equated productivity with independence, believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now, she saw it as a strength, an act of self-awareness and trust. Her relationship with Vanessa, her manager, also deepened. Vanessa had always been supportive, but since Claire began setting boundaries and speaking up for herself, their dynamic felt more balanced. During a one-on-one meeting, Vanessa said, "I've noticed a change in you, Claire. You seem steadier, more confident." Claire hesitated, then decided to share a part of her journey. "I've been working through some things in therapy," she admitted. "It's helped me understand how much I've been carrying and how it's affected me at work." Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. And for what it's worth, I think the work you've done on yourself is making you an even better leader." The validation felt different this time, less like an external reward and more like a reflection of the internal growth Claire had fought so hard to achieve. Outside of work, Claire's personal life began to flourish in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her decision to revisit the site of her car accident had been a turning point in her healing process. The act of confronting that painful memory head-on had opened a door she hadn't realized was locked. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, she pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began to write a letter to herself. "Dear Claire, you've spent so much time running from what happened, but it's time to stop. You're not broken. You're not defined by that moment. You're strong because of how you've carried yourself through it all. It's okay to let go of the guilt and fear. It's okay to move forward." As she finished writing, Claire felt a profound sense of relief. It wasn't that the pain of the trauma disappeared, it was that she had finally acknowledged it in a way that felt freeing. She folded the letter and placed it in her journal, a tangible reminder of the promise she had made to herself. Her friendships also deepened. With Max, she no longer felt like a burden, constantly leaning on his support without giving anything in return. Their conversations became more balanced, with Claire asking about his challenges and offering advice of her own. "You're a good listener," Max said one evening as they walked through the park. Claire laughed. "That's because I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like to feel stuck." With her sister Emma, the walls that had once divided them seemed to crumble. One weekend, Emma invited Claire to a family dinner. Claire hesitated, her memories of past gatherings tinged with feelings of inadequacy and tension, but this time she chose to go. The dinner wasn't perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, and her father still asked pointed questions about her job. But Claire didn't feel the same pressure to prove herself. When her father said, "You're working hard, right?" Claire smiled and replied, "I'm doing my best, and that's enough." Emma squeezed her hand under the table, a silent show of support. The most unexpected consequence of Claire's journey was the inspiration she became for others. One day, Vanessa asked her to speak at a company wellness event about balancing productivity and mental health. At first, Claire was hesitant. Sharing her struggles with trauma felt vulnerable, especially in a professional setting. But as she thought about it, she realized how powerful her story could be. Standing in front of a room full of her colleagues, Claire took a deep breath and began. "I used to think that working harder and pushing through pain was the only way to succeed," she said. "But I've learned that ignoring what's weighing you down doesn't make it go away. It just makes it heavier." She spoke about her journey with therapy, her struggle to set boundaries, and the small steps that had helped her reclaim her sense of control. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Several colleagues approached her afterward to thank her for her honesty. "I've been dealing with some things myself," one co-worker said. "Hearing you talk about it makes me feel like I'm not alone." Claire's heart swelled. For so long, she had felt isolated in her pain. But now she realized how universal the struggle was, and how much strength there was in sharing it. That evening, as she reflected on the day, Claire felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation: pride. Not the fleeting pride of meeting a deadline or achieving a goal, but the deep, enduring pride of knowing she had done the hard work of healing. She wrote in her journal, "The weight of trauma didn't disappear. It's still there, but it's lighter now, because I'm not carrying it alone anymore." The turning point in Claire's journey had set her on a path of not just recovery, but growth. She began to realize that the productivity she had once equated with worth was no longer the driving force in her life. Instead, she started to focus on balance, at work, in her relationships, and within herself. Claire's newfound clarity didn't come overnight, nor was it without setbacks. But for the first time in years, she felt equipped to handle challenges without succumbing to the crushing weight of anxiety or the perfectionism that had once controlled her. At work, Claire's team had become one of the most cohesive in the company. She had learned to delegate effectively and trust her colleagues to carry their share of the workload. In doing so, she discovered that leadership wasn't about doing everything yourself. It was about empowering others. One of her proudest moments came during a team brainstorming session for a new marketing campaign. Claire had always been the type to dominate such meetings, ensuring every idea presented was polished and actionable. But this time, she stepped back, allowing her team members to take the lead. Carla, who had once struggled with self-doubt, proposed a bold, unconventional concept: That's risky, another team member commented, raising an eyebrow. Claire smiled. Sometimes risks lead to the best results. Let's explore it further. The idea ultimately became the foundation of the campaign, which went on to receive praise from both the client and upper management. Watching Carla's confidence grow in the aftermath was more rewarding to Claire than any personal accolade. Outside of work, Claire began to rebuild her life in ways that felt meaningful. Her relationship with Emma deepened as the two sisters made a habit of spending Sundays together. They often went on long walks or sat in Claire's apartment, sharing stories and laughter over cups of tea. "You seem lighter," Emma said one afternoon as they strolled through a local park. "I feel lighter," Claire admitted. "I'm not carrying so much anymore." Emma paused, her expression thoughtful. "I wish I'd known how much you were struggling before. I would have been there for you." "You're here now," Claire replied, squeezing her sister's hand. "That's what matters." One of the biggest changes in Claire's life was her relationship with herself. Therapy with Dr. Carter had taught her to challenge the inner voice that told her she wasn't good enough. When the critical thoughts crept in, she practiced reframing them. "You're falling behind," the voice would whisper. "You're moving at your own pace, and that's okay," Claire would counter. Dr. Carter had also encouraged Claire to embrace self-compassion, a concept that had once felt foreign to her. Slowly, Claire learned to treat herself with the kindness she so readily offered others. She began journaling, not just to process her emotions, but to celebrate her achievements, no matter how small. One entry read, "Today, I said no to a project that didn't align with my priorities. That's growth." Another, "I had a hard day, but I didn't push myself to the brink. I rested, and that's enough." Claire's personal growth was perhaps most evident in how she approached her trauma. Revisiting the site of the accident had been a pivotal moment, but it wasn't the end of her healing journey. One evening, she decided to share the story of the accident with Emma, something she had never done in detail before. "It was raining," Claire began, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember seeing the truck out of the corner of my eye, and then everything went black. When I woke up in the hospital, I thought I was fine, but I wasn't." As she spoke, the memories that had once felt unbearable became more manageable, like puzzle pieces finally fitting into place. "I think I've been punishing myself ever since," Claire admitted, "for surviving, for not being able to move on." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to carry that anymore, Claire. You've already done more than enough." Over time, Claire began to embrace activities she had avoided for years. She started driving again, taking short trips at first and gradually venturing farther. The act of getting behind the wheel, once a source of panic, became a symbol of her progress. She also returned to her passion for painting, setting up a small studio in her apartment. Her art, once a neglected hobby, became a way to express emotions she couldn't put into words. Her favorite piece was a painting she titled Resilience. It featured a cracked, golden sun rising over a turbulent sea, representing the balance between struggle and hope. The most surprising aspect of Claire's growth was how it inspired others. Her colleagues began seeking her out, not just for professional guidance, but for advice on managing their own stress. One afternoon, Carla approached her after a meeting. "I just wanted to say thank you," Carla said. "The way you've handled everything, your honesty, your balance, it's been a reminder that we don't have to be perfect to succeed." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with pride. That evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, Claire reflected on her journey. The trauma she had once ignored no longer defined her. It was still a part of her story, but it wasn't the whole story. She opened her journal and wrote, "Growth isn't about becoming someone new. It's about uncovering who you've been all along." The crisp air of early spring brushed against Claire's face as she stood on the balcony of her apartment. Below her, the city buzzed with its usual energy, cars honking, people rushing to their destinations, and the faint sound of a street musician playing a familiar tune. For the first time in years, Claire felt at peace with the chaos around her. She held a cup of tea in her hands, the steam curling into the cool morning air. Her journal sat open on the table beside her, its pages a testament to her journey, a chronicle of struggle, resilience, and growth. Claire had spent so long running from her trauma, believing that moving forward meant leaving it behind entirely. But now she understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to carry it with grace. At work, Claire had finally struck a balance between ambition and well-being. She no longer stayed late into the night out of guilt or fear. Instead, she set realistic boundaries, trusting her team to handle their responsibilities and allowing herself the space to recharge. One Friday afternoon, Vanessa raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course, let me know on Monday." Later that evening, Claire sat with Max at their favorite coffee shop. "I thought this was what you wanted," Max said, sipping his espresso. "It is," Claire replied, "but I want to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons." "And what are the right reasons?" Max asked, leaning forward. Claire smiled thoughtfully. "Because I'm ready to grow, not because I feel like I have to prove something." On Monday, Claire accepted the promotion, but this time she approached the role with a sense of purpose, not pressure. She delegated tasks, encouraged collaboration, and focused on creating an environment where her team could thrive. Her first major project as senior project manager was a resounding success. But the real victory came when Carla, now a confident team member, stopped by her office to share her own news. "I'm applying for a leadership role on another team," Carla said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I feel ready." Claire felt a swell of pride, not just for Carla, but for the ripple effect of her own growth. Outside of work, Claire's life was richer than it had ever been. Her weekly dinners with Emma had become a cherished tradition, a time for laughter and connection. One evening, as they shared a plate of homemade pasta, Emma said, "I've been thinking about going back to school. Watching you rebuild your life has inspired me to do the same." Claire was taken aback, but deeply moved. "You'd be amazing, Emma. Whatever you decide, I'll be here to cheer you on." Their relationship, once strained by misunderstanding and distance, was now a source of mutual support and love. One of the most significant moments in Claire's journey came when she was invited to speak at a conference on mental health in the workplace. The thought of sharing her story in front of a large audience was daunting, but Claire knew how powerful it could be. Standing on the stage, the spotlight warm on her face, she began, "For years, I thought success meant pushing through pain, ignoring my limits, and proving my worth through constant achievement. But ignoring what's weighing you down doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it heavier." As she spoke about her accident, her struggles with productivity, and her path to healing, she saw nods of understanding in the audience. "The most important lesson I've learned," Claire continued, "is that healing isn't about being perfect. It's about being kind to yourself, taking small steps, and allowing others to support you along the way." When she finished, the applause was overwhelming. Several attendees approached her afterward to share their own stories, and Claire felt an overwhelming sense of connection. For so long, she had felt alone in her pain. Now she saw how universal the struggle was, and how much strength came from sharing it. As the months passed, Claire continued to grow, not just professionally but personally. She pursued her passion for painting, submitting her work to a local art show. One of her pieces, Resilience, sold on opening night, and the buyer left her a note. "This painting speaks to me. Thank you for creating it." Driving, once a source of panic, became a symbol of her freedom. She took weekend road trips, exploring small towns and quiet trails, reclaiming the joy she had once associated with fear. On a warm summer evening, Claire sat on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky. She opened her journal and wrote, "I thought trauma had taken something from me, but in facing it, I found more than I ever thought possible: peace, connection, and a sense of who I truly am." Closing the journal, Claire smiled. Her journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, but she knew she had the tools, the support, and the inner strength to face them. For the first time in years, she felt free, not just from her trauma, but from the need to prove her worth to anyone, including herself. And that, Claire realized, was the greatest victory of all.